Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. We interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. Just as I was starting this podcast, announcements were coming out for the English language release of The Adventures of Robin Hood, a new board game from the talented Michael Menzel, whose cooperative fantasy epic, Legends of Andor, has been a smash hit amongst gamers on both sides of the Atlantic. As someone who enjoys cooperative board games and just happens to be a fan of this Robin Hood character, the game was a sure purchase for me. After the game was released and I was able to get a few games in, the publisher Cosmos was good enough to put me in touch with Michael, who was happy to share with me insights on the creative process that went into the game as the game's designer, writer, and illustrator. I admit that this is a somewhat embarrassing interview for me, as I find myself gushing over the game. My family and I really had an immense amount of fun, and it ranks high amongst the best-looking games I've ever played as well. However, Michael was frank about some of the criticism that the game has received. Mostly in that it lacks the strategic depth that real serious gamers tend to crave. Although that is largely intentional. This is a game that is intended to be played around the dinner table with families, which brought to mind a point that often goes through my mind in regards to adaptations of Robin Hood. Robin Hood is a figure that dances back and forth between being a cartoonish figure for children and a grim and decidedly adult vigilante. For his game, Michael very intentionally sought a middle path, a Robin Hood that didn't come across as silly or childish, but not quite one that seems to have stepped out of an Assassin's Creed game either. I'm often hesitant to give blanket recommendations for some of the various Robin Hood adaptations that I discuss on the podcast or on social media, as some of it can be perfectly wonderful work, but not well suited for every audience. I can say about the Adventures of Robin Hood board game, though, that both my 12-year-old son and my 45-year-old brother-in-law enjoyed the game and were always eager to play the next chapter. Now, string your bow, draw your blade, and perhaps clear off your gaming table as we enter the Greenwood with game designer and artist Michael Menzel, as we discuss his process of blending mechanics and theme and how Nottingham almost became the city of Florence. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. Where are you joining me from exactly?
It's called Neukirchen-Flühen. It's a small town near Düsseldorf.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you again for taking time in your evening to join me here. I appreciate it a lot. As I said in some of the emails, I've been playing the game, Adventures of Robin Hood. I played a session of it last night with my son and my sister and her husband. We just completed chapter 5. Definitely avoid giving any spoilers on the podcast here. But it's really fun. I'm enjoying the game quite a lot. We're kind of a board gaming family, so we enjoy maybe not like the really in-depth, highly detailed strategic games, but especially cooperative games and kind of immersive adventure games like this. So it's definitely scratching that itch. Having the Robin Hood theme, obviously in my case in particular, is extra fun.
Yes.
And then the game itself feels really unique and interesting. And that's something that I want to touch on a little bit. So for listeners who are joining us on the podcast, I was hoping you could just start by introducing yourself a little bit and how you got started in that kind of combined world of art and board game design.
Okay. I'm Michael Menzel, and yeah, the whole career actually started by accident. It was I ran into an old friend who was already a designer for board games, and I had no job, and I asked him if I can illustrate a game for him, and that was the first assignment, and then I found out, okay, that's a dream job, and I really want to do more of it, and so I did, and while I was illustrating games, I came across a lot of game ideas and a lot of games, and I I wasn't a player as a child, but I really began to like it as an adult, job-wise. And yeah, and when my son and my nephew were about 9 years old, we were really great fans of a lot of the Rings, and we tried to find a game that covers this theme. And but most of them were really very complex. A lot of rules to learn, and so because the kids were just 9 years old, in one holiday, we started to develop our own game, and so I took some cardboard with me, and I drew the castle, and they painted the forest, and we took tokens and figures out of other games and made up our own game, and it was part of our holidays every time, and at one point I had so many thoughts about the game, and it took so much place in my head that I thought, okay, I have to show it to a publisher once, and if they would have said it's nothing, go away, then it would have been okay for me. I probably would have not showed it to anyone else. But the publisher liked it right away, and that was the starting point for Legends of Andor, my first board game as a designer. And yeah, 2 years later it was published and kind of successful, and that was the first game where to come back to your initial question, was the first game where I combined illustration and the game idea, and that's very close to each other in both games of mine, and and that's how it started.
Legends of Andor has been a big success, I understand. I certainly enjoyed it a lot as a game. It was a game that I was happy to find because I've always kind of liked the fantasy genre, a big fan of Lord of the Rings also. And one of my problems with a lot of the kind of big fantasy board games out there, even ones that I thought were pretty well done, is that there was frequently this component of, well, you all have your heroes and your heroic characters, and they're kind of leveling up and getting experience and skills and special items to help them defeat, some sort of evil presence, whether it's an invading kingdom or something very Lord of the Rings like a Sauron type figure, some dark menacing lord or an evil dragon. But almost always it was still a competitive game, even though there was a single adversary. All of these different heroes were somehow always just competing to sort of see who beat the bad guy first. And one of the things I really like about Legends of Andor is that it still has that kind of high epic fantasy feel, but the heroes are actually working together. Yeah. So was that part of the enjoyment of Lord of the Rings? Was it the design process kind of with your family? Where did that impetus to make it a cooperative game come from?
It's totally based on the idea that we wanted to play it with my kids, with my son and my nephew, and because it's a role play, they really get into their role and they really become their hero, and it felt wrong if one wins and the other one loses, and so the cooperative thing was the best thing to do, because they, both 9 years old, they are in some competition all the time, and it was great to have a game where they are forced to work together And yeah, that was spared a lot of tears and and stress, and that was good. And I do believe that for the bad guy, the dragon in Andor, he would have been far less evil if we still had the time to work for our own good all the time, that we can still take care of our own points. If like that is still important, the dragon can't be that evil. So he's really that evil, so we have to work together. It doesn't matter who gets what and who has more points. He's that evil, so we have to work together.
Exactly. And that makes so much sense to me. And I think this transitions well into the talk about the Adventures of Robin Hood board game, because Robin Hood is another theme that really lends itself well to that idea of a cooperative game. While Robin Hood might be the name that's on the movie poster, on the game box, all of the best stories really involve him working with his band of friends, working with Maid Marian and Little John and Friar Tuck and Will Scarlet and Allendale. He has this whole cast of characters that are also all really big, important personalities, and they're always cooperating and working together. So I feel that was a natural fit for another cooperative game. So along those lines, what brought Robin Hood to your mind as a figure to design a game around?
Well, the initial idea was to have a family-friendly game, which should be very easy to set up, because that was the one thing some people said about Andor, that the lots of material makes it hard to get even started, to sort all kinds of tiles and tokens and figures, and so I wanted it to be very easy to be set up. It should have been a family game, and the initial idea was to play on a picture, or to play a picture, because usually as an illustrator, I draw nice landscapes, and after a while I have to have some grid all over it, or some spaces, where to put your figures and all that symbolic stuff and iconography and all that. And I wanted to have it just a picture. And so I was trying to think about a possibility to avoid any sort of spaces and fields, and it took a while, and then I found out this mechanism how to move in Robin Hood. These figures, that you put side by side, and then you know how far you can walk. And when I had this mechanism, I was sure it has to be cooperative, because if that's a competitive game, it doesn't work, because people would say, okay, you pushed your figure too far. So at that point, it was clear it has to be cooperative. It has to be a family game. So yeah, and Robin Hood, to me, felt like a very good decision, because it's a very family-friendly topic, theme. And personally, I really do like it. I watched the Disney movie when I was very young. I watched Kevin Costner when I got the first girlfriend in cinema. So I was very good with Robin Hood anyway, and because of the kind of game that it was already, it had to be a topic that fits to the mechanism,
Yeah. Yeah, so for the sake of our listeners who might not be familiar with the game, there's a set of, I think, 8 kind of large puzzle pieces that all fit together to make a single large board. And that board is a single illustrated painting that depicts Sherwood Forest, a village, a castle, and it is the board that your figures move around on, and they interact with different spaces. They avoid guards, they meet townsfolk. They look for treasures and items. They hide in the shadowy areas, but there's no lines, there's no grids, there's no hexes. It's all very organic, very uninterrupted, except for little numbers around certain spots. And then the figures you use are these little wooden tokens, and you have a series of wooden tokens for each character that you use to kind of determine the path that they move along. And I hadn't thought about that before, but you're right. I have played a few games that are similar, like miniature kind of skirmish games, like X-Wing is one, where you do have these kind of movement templates, and you have to be really careful to be precise. And if you bump things a little bit, then there is that potential for argument at the table. But when everybody's on the same side, nobody's going to care that much if your figure got nudged a little bit more. Nobody's going to be upset if you're a millimeter away from where you had originally started. That's
Yeah.
a really interesting point that I hadn't thought. And you're right, that does help reinforce that, like, oh yeah, that's right, it's cooperative, we're all working together anyway.
You have to see, designing a board game, the really strange thing about it is you can do almost everything. We have a market for almost every theme, every topic. It doesn't matter, it's up to you. You can use whatever mechanism you prefer, and you can play test it all by yourself with some cardboard and some tokens. So the possibilities are limitless, and that's not only a good thing. It's so whenever I found something like this mechanism, how to move the figures, I was happy to have one checkbox filled, to know, okay, now it has to be cooperative. If I want to keep this mechanism,
Yeah.
it has to be cooperative. So I don't have to think about some competitive theme or topic anymore. And that's really helpful, because there are so many possibilities and you can go everywhere. And it's really a good thing if you can say, okay, a few things are clear now.
So I found your designer diary notes that you wrote up and posted on Board Game Geek. And I thought that was a really interesting look into the process. And there were a number of notes there that I really appreciated. You talked about how, so that it is very story based, and you don't play one session and then just reset everything and start another session and everything's the same as the last time you played. There's a story that you're really progressing through, and the board itself will change from one session to the next, which is a really unique component. There's these little windows and tokens. It's been described as being a little bit like an advent calendar in that way, at least in terms of how it looks. But you flip them out, and sometimes you remove them from the board, sometimes you flip them over. And so the board can look entirely different from the start of one session to the start of the next, which is a really fun and interesting and very different element from most games I've ever encountered. But one of the things I appreciated reading through your designer notes was how initially, to kind of make the story flow, you had everything done on these cards, and it got very complicated. And that became a book. And the game comes with this lovely little hardbound book with ribbons in it to help mark your place. And that adds to that element of it feels like you're playing through a story because you have the book there. And I really appreciated your comment about how doing it as an app instead of a book was never an option for you. And I know that's a very trendy thing. Lots of games, including cooperative story-based ones, do lean a lot on apps these days. Personally, I'm not big on that. I prefer not to have the phone out at the table and having the book, and we pass the book around at the table. So when one player lands on a spot, I'll pass the book to the player next to me, and they'll be the one that reads the entry for me, which I believe is part of the whole intent. And it feels very, I don't know, very family-like. It's got that idea of we're really reading the story to each other. Was that sort of the idea behind why you didn't want to do an app, or was there anything else involved?
No, it's exactly this. So as you mentioned before, there were a lot of cards before, but because it should have been family friendly, and I didn't want to have them to sort a lot of cards. The idea came up to put it in a book, because the book you just have to put on the table and it's done. It's sorted by itself. So that was a huge fortune, and and then the publisher, when I showed it to them, they mentioned an app, how that we could have a nice speaker and some atmospheric music or whatever. But whenever I play tested it, there was at least one player that loved to read, that took the book, that had a deep voice, or really tried to talk like the Smiths, the blacksmiths, or whatever, and it was so much fun. And if you put in an app, it's a professional, and none of us can beat a professional. So you take away that fun from the group and from one of the players. You take it away because you put in a professional, and so I thought it's much better this way, and it's designed to play it with family. It's designed to play it with kids, and I think it's maybe somehow old-fashioned, but it's kind of lovely to see your 9-year-old reading out of a book, and you read to him, and what you described right now, that was intended.
Yeah, something that kind of got me started on doing this podcast was based on reading the stories of Robin Hood to somebody, and really enjoying that experience of reading it to them, and that kind of inspired wanting to delve a little bit more into that world. And I do think you have a little bit more of that kind of real personal connection when you're reading things aloud to people, and to get an element of that with a board game while you're also kind of cooperatively problem solving, because that's what a lot of the stories are based on. You're kind of presented a task or a problem, and you have to figure out how you're all going to work together to solve it. It does kind of create a lot of that nice feel, and has a lot more of that immersive sort of storybook quality that I've seen other games reach for and succeed with to varying degrees. But I think this one does a very nice job of finding that balance, and it works very well for Robin Hood. But speaking of,
thank you very much.
Speaking, I am really a big fan. Like, it's a highlight of my week when I get to come back home and get my sister and her husband over and play this with my son and the four of us. It's really very enjoyable. What I wanted to ask, though, to segue from the idea of reading Robin Hood stories, is what were your kind of primary sources of inspiration to help you write your Robin Hood stories for this game? Where were you kind of drawing from?
As I mentioned, I saw Kevin Costner, and in the 80s there were this show with the Planet kind of version, music, the soundtrack of Planet. I had a vague memory of this, and but very important influence for the historical background was a book by Rebecca Gablé. She's a historical author, and she made a very fun to read book about the English history of kings. I'm not that educated. I'm not kind of I'm no scientist, so I couldn't get deep into the material, but that was a great source, because she made kind of fast forward through English history, and that was a great, and I was really surprised that some of the stuff that we encounter in movies, that Prince John really attempted to overthrow his brother, and that the King of France had something to do with it, that it seemed to me to be historical correct, and that was a good influence. And actually, but I wanted to write my own story of Robin Hood, and I'm kind of nervous that people like you who are really, really into it might not dislike it, because it's something new or something different than it probably should have been. But because it is a story game, a story needs twists that you don't see coming, and some unexpected story twists. And so if I copied a story from A to Z, then it would be kind of boring for people who know it already. So Robin Hood has the great fortune that people can connect to it very easily, and everyone has some memory of it, or some idea of what is about to happen in the story. But then you can divide from that and tell it a little bit different, and it's actually kind of the same like I did with Legends of Andor, which obviously is influenced by Lord of the Rings. You can take some of the stuff that people know already, and you don't have to explain it, because I wanted, especially Robin Hood should have been a game for a family that is easy to enter. And the great thing is, I just need to say Sheriff of Nottingham, and everybody knows, okay, that's the bad guy,
Right.
So
Yep.
And I had a different approach in between to go to Florence as
Yes.
a setting.
Yes.
So I switched the setting, but that was so difficult to explain. We are these people, and the other ones are the bad guys, but and I had some weird Italian names, and no one could remember them, and it was so much easier to work with Robin Hood because everybody knew already.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that I try to draw from a lot with this podcast is, because there's already that familiarity that everybody has, it makes an easy access point. And sometimes I'll use it to explore how Robin Hood is presented in different forms of media, in the movies, or in something like board games, but also sometimes just to talk about what life in the Middle Ages was really like. And Robin Hood is that entry point. It's like, well, you've seen Robin Hood movies, you have an idea of who he is. What would their life have really been like? What actually would it have been like to hunt deer in Sherwood Forest? And it's a great way to reach people, to have that, here's a connection, here's something familiar, something you've heard of. And I think that's really, really, really great that you were able to draw on that for the board game, and then kind of tell your own story with the character that is familiar.
A very important part of Robin Hood is that he's so neutral. For example, actually we do bad things. We fight people, we rob the nobles, and all that, actually bad things. But because he doesn't do it for himself, it works. So he's kind of a prototype for a modern hero. I don't know so much about Robin Hood as you do, but I remembered for example, the Kevin Costner movie, he started some sort of revolution, and at the end, when the king returns, he steps aside, and it seems to be one thing about him, that he doesn't want the power or the money or the whatever for himself. He gives it to others, or steps aside, and I believe that's the way he works. That's why he's so different from any pirate, who just gains the stuff for himself.
Yeah, I was commenting when we were playing the game last night that I really like how there's a resource of hope that you have on the board, and you need to try to manage that hope, and things get worse for you if kind of hope runs out, and that hope is not representative of necessarily your characters, but of the people in the area, the villagers in Nottingham, the hope of the land, I think the game refers to it. And the easiest way for that hope to increase is by robbing noblemen. And the little marker on the board that moves to show that hope has increased is called the bard. And so how that represents, these nobles have been defeated, their wealth is being shared with people, and bards are singing stories about it, and that's why the hope is going up. And it was a little bit subtle because some of this is abstracted. It's a little marker on the board, and nobody's like playing the bard, and it's not written into the story because you're kind of involved with the task you have to solve. But kind of putting together that that's what all of these things represented felt really rewarding, and I really liked that aspect, and that it did reinforce that idea that your characters weren't just doing all of these actions for their own gain, and that's why this resource was increasing, and that it was inspiring the people around them, and that there's a bard out there singing songs about them.
Yeah, yeah. Earlier draft, it was like actually I wanted to gain some coins or some items, and the hope was intended to rise just when you deliver it to some poor people. So that was the even more thematically approach. But game-wise, it didn't feel good, because you have this great moment, you defeat the nobleman and nothing happens. You get the item, and then the rather boring stuff, like you walk from A to B and deliver the bread or the gold or whatever. That was the point where you got some money. So I had to cut out this boring part of it, and that was by saying the hope increases, and your doing is the people benefit from seeing that they can be defeated, and yeah, that what rises the hope.
I was wondering a little bit about which characters you chose to use and why. I could have seen a space, and I don't know if this was in any of your playtests, where one of the characters might have been a bard, might have been Alan a Dale, and they had a special ability that could increase hope or something like that. Were there any thoughts along those lines? Because the characters you settled on were Robin Hood, of course, Maid Marian, Little John, and Will Scarlet.
Yeah. Well, these are the ones that seem to be the ones that people know best. In Germany, it seems to be that way. So the others are not so well known, and of course the most famous one, Friar Tuck. I knew exactly that I wanted to have him for an expansion, because sometimes people say, okay, I had the game, I don't need the expansion, but I knew if I call the expansion Friar Tuck, everybody wants to have the expansion and wants to have Friar Tuck. So that was kind of a marketing idea. But these four characters, and I would have loved to get deeper into the characters, but that's always combined with complexity. In a former version, everyone had his own reward paper, so the actions that Little John does would have affected the way people react if he encounters them, but that was all too difficult. It was all too much. In comparisons to Andor, where you have your own character and you develop him and you have the picture of him in front of you, in Robin Hood we are more abstract. It's just the green figure or the blue figure, and so there's a little bit more distance between you and your character.
I feel that there's pros and cons to that. I think it does help you kind of imagine yourself a little bit more in that role, but gets a little bit away from the role-playing aspect. And I think it was a bold and interesting choice, and does certainly make things simpler and easier to just kind of get things rolling, and you can set up and start playing really quite quickly for a game that has as much depth and change from one session to the next as this one does. In regards to the storytelling and this idea that you're getting to write your own Robin Hood story, in the book, as you're playing through this game, there's a decision point and the story kind of branches off, and you got to really kind of work in two different stories, and you really only will get to play through one of them unless you go and then replay the game, of course, in which case you could then play the other story path. I noticed in your design notes that you had come up with 3 stories. And obviously we don't want to go into what the 2 that are in the game, because we don't want to spoil them for anyone. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the 3rd story that didn't get included.
It's easy. This is the part where Friar Tuck plays a big role, and this is actually the part that I separated, and this you will play when you play the expansion. Uh,
Okay.
in Germany, it's released this year, and yeah, that's the third branch. I had a historical moment, or I found a historical moment that fits very very nicely into the whole concept, and that you will encounter if you play the expansion.
Okay, so the third story got folded into the expansion, so we still can't get into too many details there.
Yeah.
All right. So be it. Yeah, I did see that expansion is coming out. I think it's called The Adventures of Robin Hood. Is it Friar Tuck in Danger or something?
Yes.
In
Yes.
English, at least. As you said, it's coming out in Germany this year. I saw the cover art for it. It's gorgeous. I do like the cover art for the main box also. It's wonderful. I'm hoping the English version will follow before too long.
I believe it's doing very well in the English market, so I'm pretty sure.
Great.
Will,
good to hear.
Will be released. Yeah.
So, speaking of the cover art in your designer notes that you posted, when you were talking about the design process for the cover, you talked about how you really wanted to focus on the hero and like Robin Hood as a hero and wanting that to be a figure that drew people in, and how you saw a lot of importance in heroic figures as people could connect to. And so I was sort of wondering what some of your sort of heroic inspirations were maybe when you were growing up.
Yeah, I grew up with Star Wars and Marvel, of course, Spider-Man, and Robin Hood, of course. And but although I do love Man in Tights, which is really really funny, and I saw it in the movie too in the cinema when I was young. It kind of made Robin Hood silly. At least in Germany, it's green tights and funny head and all that kind of stuff. And I was really concerned about having a serious story and a serious hero. And as you probably noticed, the book is not funny at all. There's not one funny line. It's not like, "Hey, doodly, we're about to rob someone," and it's the people are suffering, and it's really serious. And I needed to be that serious because it's so easy to ridicule Robin Hood, and it's so easy to get lost, get the whole point of it. What are we doing, And so, and the cover, I wanted to deliver this seriousness. This is a really cool hero with the shadow over the eyes. The eyes are the windows to our soul, and if you have glasses on or sunglasses, you shut that down, so that makes you kind of cool. The emotion is missing, and that's what he has. With his hood, you barely see his eyes, so he's a really cool guy, and these are the two poles. I have the very cool guy that could be on a Assassin's Creed cover, but on the other hand side, I do have the name Robin Hood, which is a brand of not getting violent, not being extra adult. So between those two poles, I created the cover, so that the mother would still say, "Okay, let's play Robin Hood," but the kids are not bored, like, I want to play something cool. So I wanted to get them together at the table.
I think that's a really good point, and that's where my preference for Robin Hood lies. I think you do kind of get reactions to the character where he either gets spoofed and silly. I made a comment earlier this year about the only time you see Robin Hood wearing the pointed hat anymore is if it's like a kid's cartoon or if it's a parody like Men in Tights.
Mhm.
And other like you almost can't put him in that hat without people just thinking he's silly anymore. But at the same time, there is this kind of fascination with taking things, especially things from our childhood, and making them extra grim and violent. I can't take my son who loves Batman to see most Batman movies in the movie theaters because they're really grim and violent and dark. And Robin Hood, like a lot of these characters, can be done in so many different ways. You can do a Batman who is very silly and spoofy, the Adam West kind of style,
Mhm.
or you can do one that's very grim and very dark, or you can find a middle ground where he is still engaging and interesting, not boring, not silly, but also not overly depressing and dark and violent.
Yes.
And I think that is a really good place for Robin Hood, especially if you're wanting it to be a family friendly game. So you're in that space where it's family friendly, it's still engaging, but it's not just silly and goofy.
Yeah, and personally, I don't like violent movies too. So it's just like it's too much, and so and it's the same with Legends of Endor. It's at no point it's really bloody or that or dark. It's tension. It has tension.
Yeah,
It's
things
fun.
are serious but not dark.
Yeah, yeah. And for example, we have the one mechanism in Andor, which some people don't like because they think it's kind of a punishment. Because whenever you defeat a creature, the narrator moves on one spot, and if he reaches the end of the track, you've lost. So you cannot just go around and kill everything that's all around you, hack and slay through all the monsters. You have to really have to look which is necessary, which we should better leave alone. And but for me, it makes sense in terms of that's the storyteller, and he tells whenever something great happened. And whenever you defeated someone, he tells about it, and so the story progresses. And game wise, it's very important because the game, by this narrator, the game knows how strong the heroes are, because with every defeated creature they get some reward, and that makes them stronger. So whenever the narrator moves forward, I know I have to put in more creatures or more evil creatures. So it's very important for the balance. And but I'm getting off topic. But it never gets dark.
I appreciate it a lot. I've dabbled a little bit in board game design myself, and this was really one of the challenges that I faced. I kind of co-developed and wrote a game about Russian folklore called Baba Yaga, and in it there's all of these quests and tasks and adventures that your bogatirs, your heroes, are encountering. And as they do this, they get rewards and they get stronger. They find the magical weapons, they get allies, but then they still have to have more challenges. And how do you start making those challenges continue to have tension? And what we hit upon was that it started being based around their reputation, that more was expected of them as they kind of went along and got better. And that's what made the challenges harder. So I appreciate that there is that kind of thought and element to Legends of Andor. And what really made me kind of love that game and love that mechanic right away was in the very first adventure, there's a shift where you suddenly have a different task you need to do. And again, I'm not going to go into details and give spoilers about it. But in order to accomplish that task, my son and I realized that we couldn't kill any more of the monsters or we'd run out of time. So we had to really we had to totally change our plan. And we ended up kind of hiding in some caverns as the monsters passed us by. And that feeling of, oh, this is also something very cinematic. That feels like a moment in Lord of the Rings when the heroes take cover and you see the enemies like rushing by them. and then they are able to come out and complete their mission that matters more than just killing monsters. That felt cinematic in ways that just defeating monsters didn't, and that was the moment that made me really fall in love with that game too. And one of the things I really appreciate about the Adventures of Robin Hood is you do also kind of have that similar aspect where your tasks and your missions and your focuses and the things you're trying to accomplish can change as your characters learn more information. It's not just about getting more powerful. It's not just about ramping up your character's abilities. It's about meeting the needs of the story that you're in and the characters that you're introducing. Meeting a character and finding out that they're in peril and that you need to rescue them and get them to a certain place at a certain time. It adds a really dynamic story-driven quality to it. That's really fun. And I liked your designer note, as long as I'm just continuing to gush over your work here, about how you like to take the little characters at the end of a session and put them around the campfire and their secret hideout, and how it reminded you of Asterix and Obelix, and that idea of and then the great story ends with having a feast around the campfire and getting to recount those events. That added to the camaraderie of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I do feel a little bit bad for the listeners because I can't go, because we have to tiptoe so much around the story and we can't go into any particulars. They just kind of get to hear me say how great I think it is. I guess since we can't talk about any of the details, in the designer notes, you mentioned that there's a while you're thinking of the Thieves of Florence. You were briefly thinking of a floating islands version of the game. Mm-hmm. Was it the movement mechanic that was kind of inspiring that notion of kind of this kind of hopping to floating island to floating island?
Yeah. It was, as an illustrator, I'm used to have different approaches. So I don't, when I make a draft for a cover, I cannot fall in love with it. I have to have several different versions so that the publisher can decide. So I'm not an artist. I'm working. I want the publisher to be happy, and so it kind of is part of my DNA to have one theme or topic and say, okay, would it work better if I change everything and have flying islands or Thieves of Florence or whatever, just to make sure I'm doing the right thing, and especially the trip to Florence was very important because I love having my games thematically correct. But as I mentioned before, the part where you gain the loot and bring it to some poor people, that was deliberate, that was game-wise no fun. And but I wasn't able to see that this is too much. And so I took the trip to Florence and changed a lot of stuff and felt free and lost a lot of weight and complexity. And then I could return to Sherwood Forest and see, okay, I don't need this and this special rule. I just don't need it. It's not necessary for the target group, and it's not necessary for the fun. But because you always have to ask yourself, where's the fun in it? Where's in that mechanism? What am I trying to prove? Am I a great designer or whatever? And that doesn't count. The only thing that counts is is it fun? And for example, when I thought about the shadows on the board, that we have areas that are bright and some areas that are covered in shadow, and the guards cannot see Robin Hood and his friends when they are in the shadow. And it's fun to move a little bit far, less far, but to stay safe in the shadow. It feels cinematic, and all the rules that are just too much and not really fun and not really necessary, you have to be capable of cut them out and that's so difficult because kill your darlings.
Yeah, yeah.
You get so used to stuff and believe these are important parts, and you cut them away, and you feel like, okay, they weren't necessary at all. And I really have to thank all my playtesters that went through a lot of versions that were no fun at all. I can imagine so many years of developing. It wasn't fun at the beginning. And yeah, I'm very thankful for all that help.
Yeah, there's always so much to be said for those early game playtesters who will take those ideas that you have put out and try to muddle through them. I remember the first time I did, hosted a playtesting session for that game I was just talking about, and the initial feedback I got was just like, "Oh, this game is impossible and I hate it." And it's like, "Oh, but my ideas seem so good in my head." Yeah, I think I noticed in the design notes that the very initial kind of concepts and ideas that sort of over time evolved and morphed and became the game occurred when you were on a family vacation in 2017. And then the German edition of the game, it first came out in, was it 2020 or 2021?
21.
Yeah, so it came out just last year. And I know the English version came out kind of late 2021. So it was between 2017 and 2021 to get between those early drafts and initial concepts to the finished product. So a process of roughly 4 years, although maybe 3 years with all the print time. Is that about right?
Yep, that's right.
And a lot of having to rework everything, kill your babies as part of that process.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the difficult thing is that you can do almost everything, and that really, it's probably comparable to a novelist who can come up with any story and with any characters, and everything can happen to those characters, and you are not bound by genre or whatever. Sometimes you have to try something new. Sometimes there are good reasons that no one else did it before because it's simply not working. So the freedom is actually the difficult thing about it, and I believe there were several games that I already invented on the way to get to Robinhood. There was a former version with cards where you have items on the cards and some wooden pieces, tokens that were put on the cards, and that affected your strengths, and that was all put aside and cut away. But these in-between steps were working games, and I could have stopped there and say, okay, it's done. But because I had this idea, it should have been a family game, and of course I wanted to have some stuff in it that has never been done before. It took a while to really get there.
Do you think that any of those ideas might get revisited for future games down the road?
I guess so. It wasn't really all crap, it was
right. It just might not work for this game,
Yes, yeah, and that's what it makes it so difficult to let them go, because they're not all bad ideas, but they're not the right fit for this game. And actually, the publisher in my case is great. They leave a lot of freedom and a lot of space for me, but it's at the same time, I have no one who says it has to be Robin Hood. They would have been okay with Thieves of Florence, and so there is no advice, and the only guide you have is your own kind of feeling. Where do you want to go, actually?
Yeah, and so that kind of gets to the last question I really wanted to ask you was what sort of feedback have you gotten in relation to it being this Robin Hood theme? Have you been finding people really have latched onto that? Have you gotten positive responses? Have you gotten any negative responses?
Well, negative, we have sometimes people expect something different. They and then they expect something more difficult or more complex. And but it is a family game, so very often you can read on Board Game Geek that people say, okay, if you play it with your kids or if you play it with not freaks, it's great. It's a great experience, but you don't have to expect Legends of Endor, for example. That's more complex, and that is Robin Hood is not that. It's family games usually in Germany. A lot of family games are very abstract or just communication games, and this is one very unique thing because you play a story, but it's not that difficult and not that complex to learn. So it's strange. But we also do have a website in Germany, and we get a lot of positive feedback from players right after Christmas that they really enjoyed it. That while it's pandemic, they have this game, they can really dive into the story and have a great time with the family around the table, and so that feels great, and that was therefore it was intended to get people who aren't playing those big games like Dune, for example. So the feedback is very well, very good. Yeah.
And the publisher Cosmos, I know that they have a UK branch. Do they have a Germany branch too, or are they primarily a UK company?
No, it's a German company.
It is a German company that has a UK branch. So they're based in Germany. Okay. Yes. And I saw in the design notes that they were totally on board with that Robin Hood theme. When you came to them with Thieves of Florence, they're like, that Robin Hood idea. Let's revisit that one.
Yeah.
So Robin Hood had a lot of good popular appeal and notions as a character there in Germany too.
Yes, of course. And the publisher was, after Legends of Endor, I told everybody that I didn't want to do another game. And that was true for a while, but then I had the idea for Robin Hood. But I kept saying, no, I'm done with designing games because I didn't want to have any expectations, any deadlines or any commitment. I wanted to develop as long as it takes. And, and when you start to say, there's a new game coming, you feel that kind of pressure. And I didn't. At any time I could say, okay, that's it. It doesn't work. I didn't tell anyone about it, so just quit. And that was a great relief because at some point it wasn't really a good game. So I was really happy I didn't tell anyone. And and when I then told Cosmos, they were very happy because they knew this game would have anyway, if it's a good game or not, it would have some attention. At least in Germany, people will have a look. He said he doesn't do any games anymore, so here's another one. Okay, and of course it will be compared to Andor, and so they knew it would be. It would have some popularity, and when they found out it's a good game too, they were extra relieved because you have a game that will be seen and it's a good one. So that's something that the publisher likes a lot.
Yeah. Well, I guess along those lines, I was going to ask if there was anything you are working on right now, but it seems like the best answer is to say no, regardless of whether or not it's true.
Actually, guess no one would believe anymore if I say I'm not working. No, actually, I'm working on new games, but it's nothing to talk about right now. But
Right.
and I don't have a publisher yet, so we'll see. But I believe it's really fun. I really enjoyed it, and with Legends of Endor, it was all by accident. It was like, what the hell is going on? But with Robin Hood, it was more, I had a clear vision of where to go with it, and it worked out so well in the end. And so yeah, I'm drawn to design more games. Yeah.
Okay, fun. Well, I look forward to seeing what else comes.
Yeah.
I only started finding your games recently. This one, obviously popped up on my radar. As soon as I started doing this podcast, I started getting people saying, "Oh, hey, did you see this game's coming out this year also?" And there was a very nice bit of synchronicity there. So I look forward to seeing what comes out in the future.
Great. Thank you.
And thanks again for taking an hour out of your evening to speak with me. I appreciate it immensely. And I hope that you have a good rest of your night.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right.
See you.
Take care.
Bye.
My thanks again to Michael Menzel for joining me in the Greenwood. Part of the mission statement for this podcast is to examine the various facets of the Robin Hood characters and legends, and I find that every discussion with a subject expert or content creator gives me some new element to consider. One common element of modern Robin Hood tales that I'm frequently critical of is when they end with the return of good King Richard, when the real Richard I was not especially good, by almost any measure, and it serves to make Robin the champion of the common people, a tool of the aristocracy. Sometimes I can be forgiving and accept that in the story world that we are presented, this is an ahistoric Richard, who, for the purpose of the tale, we can accept as a good and noble monarch, or at least one considerably better than his brother. But in the interview, Michael brought up a point that I hadn't really considered before. In the tales where Robin is functionally the head of rebellion, him helping Richard secure his throne can be seen not so much as a reflection of Richard's good character, but as a reflection of Robin's altruistic nature. It can even be seen as a way of reinforcing how he really does what he does to help others, and not because he's driven towards claiming power for himself. If you have thoughts on where Robin Hood falls on the spectrum of tool of the Plantagenet dynasty versus champion of the oppressed masses, or want to share your thoughts on the Adventures of Robin Hood board game, then feel free to get in touch via Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, where we use the handle @intogreenwood. If you wouldn't touch social media with a cloth-yard shaft, you can also email us directly via intogreenwood@gmail.com. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3, and it's brought to you by the generous support of our patrons on patreon.com/intogreenwood. If you'd like to join our merry band, you can support the podcast for as little as $1 an episode by going to patreon.com/intogreenwood. At higher levels, you can find backer-exclusive content, such as bonus audio and an exclusive Into the Greenwood t-shirt. There's a bit up now about the literary tradition of romance for Little John. All money goes to supporting the podcast, except for 10% that we set aside for our select charity of Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated foundation that implements sustainable solutions for providing clean water and food to impoverished communities around the world. If you have not alms with which to support this small podcast, You would also be doing us an immense help by leaving positive ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to us. Into the Greenwood is really lacking in reviews, which means the Podfinder algorithms won't recommend us to potential new listeners. Often it won't even show a rating. Of course, recommending the podcast yourself to others would mean a lot as well. Into the Greenwood is completely independent and ad-free, but we do need some assistance to stay that way. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.